In this video, I want to show how to set up a Unity project on a Git repository. And so I'm going to be using Unity, GitHub, but this will work the same on GitLab or any other Git repository, and I'll be using GitHub Desktop. But again, this can work with any Git client. So first thing I want to do is I need to create the repository. So there's nothing special, just call it Unity test. I'm going to make this private, but it doesn't matter, public, private. And now the one advantage of if you're using Unity or GitHub is GitHub has a git ignore. What a git ignore does is it just tells Git what files to ignore, to not track, to not put on your repository. And Unity creates a bunch of cache files that you don't want on your repository. They make it super large, and they'll actually potentially corrupt some of your project. So you want to have this. So if you don't have it, if you're using GitLab or some other Git client, you can download one. Just Google Unity git ignore, and there's a bunch out there that you can use. But so I'm using GitHub, and I'm going to use git ignore. GitHub's git ignore to create the repository. Now, next I need to clone this. Open this sucker up in GitHub, GitHub Desktop. And so it doesn't matter where I'm going to put this. I'll just put it on my desktop. Great. So I'm clone this. Now this is the reason why we did the Git repository first is because this is going to give us the folder where we're going to create our Unity project. So I'm going to leave this open. And next I'm going to open up Unity's GitHub. So now we need to create our project in that folder. So now I'm going to tell GitHub or Unity Hub that I want a new project. Be 2D or 3D. I'm going to make it a 2D project. Git test. And now I need to make sure I go to that folder that I cloned. So I have the Unity test. So I want to make sure I'm at the root, which is where the .git file is. So select this and create. So now Unity has finished creating our project. And now what we need to do is make a couple changes to both the Unity and some of the stuff that we got from GitHub, especially just the git ignore. So I'm going to show what this looks like on my GitHub desktop. So just creating a project gave me just over 8,000 file changes. And so this is wrong. One big thing that you're going to see, if you ever see anything under library or temp, it means your git ignore is not set up correctly. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go to where this repository lives. How do I get to it? No, I'll just open it up. So go to my desktop. And so now if we actually look at this git ignore, what we'll see is at the beginning here are these folders that it's telling to ignore, but these are relative paths. So relative where the git ignore is, ignore a library. And so what's the problem is with the way Unity creates itself is it creates a folder in the folder that we created, and then put all these assets. So like this library, logs, temp. And so what we want to do is we can either update our paths, or we can just move the gitignore to the right location. So now relative to this gitignore file, there's a library, there's a logs, there's a temp. And so now if we switch back to GitHub, now you notice we went from a little over 8,000 to 26. And so we want to make sure that our gitignore is in the right location. So now you can see I don't have any library, any temp files. So if you see a whole, anything over a couple hundred changes or anything in the library, move your gitignore to the right location. And so you just see something like this. Okay, so next thing is we need to change how Unity saves stuff to properly work with Git. Git is a text-based changes, so it tracks changes in text. And sometimes by default, Unity builds all of its stuff using binary files. So this .asset file, I can't view it because it's a binary file. And so every time I make a little change, we switch back to Unity. Anytime we make a change to any of these things, even our scene, Git will see it as an entirely new file and not a small individual change. So what we need to do is go to Edit, Project Settings, and then go to Editor. And we need to change our version control and our asset serialization. So first thing we want to do is change it to force text. And so we'll have to reload the project. But now if I switch back to these asset files, now we can see them as actual text. Now it might not make sense to you, but it now is at least readable changes. So now if I make a change to some game object, if I just change the camera from orthographic to perspective, that'll be a one-line change. It won't be, Git won't see it as an entirely new file, which is really important when you start getting a whole bunch of objects in your scene, that every time if someone changes the player to a different color and someone else changes the terrain, Git will see each of those as separate changes and will be able to merge them. Whereas if it was all binary files, you would have to manually lose one of those changes and have to redo it. Next thing we want to do is make sure we have visible meta files. Unity creates meta files for all of your assets. And so this where it stores some of the extra data for it. This is mainly where you import maybe some models or some images, and everything that you have in the inspector, those are all set in a meta file. So we want to make sure that those are visible, and so that Git will track those, because if you have a hidden file, Git won't track it. So once we have that set up, make sure that you see text on all of these files here. And so once you have that, you're all good to go. Simply just commit all the changes. So base project, commit that to master, and then push to origin. So just make sure you have your gitignore in the right location or update its path, and so that you're not tracking. You should only see assets, projects, and project settings, and packages. Those should be the three folders that you see up on your repository. So now if I go back to my Git repository, that's where I see the root git test, and then here I see assets, packages, and project settings. You don't want to see library, you don't want to see logs, you don't want to see any of these other files, the other folders. And you also need to make sure you set your version control to visible meta files and force all of your asset serialization to text. And then your project is all ready to work with a Git repository, whether it's on GitHub or GitLab.